So in the last video we introduced the concept of hard and soft engineering when it comes to river management strategy. Hard engineering, which is trying to control the natural processes common in the 20th century, still used some places today where there's high value land. In contrast, you've got soft engineering, which works with natural processes. It's definitely the approach preferred in the 20th century. And what we're going to do in this video is go on from having set that context of the strategy, hard or soft engineering, to take a look at the methods. These are the actual techniques that are used to fulfill the strategy, and in particular in this one we're going to be taking a look at some of the hard engineering methods. So let's jump in and have a bit more of a look. So for this, you're going to need to have your books handy. You're going to see some of the diagrams that appear in your books will appear in this presentation, along with the annotation. And when you get to those, and I've talked through them and explained them, then that's when you pause the video and you copy the annotation down. So let's jump into the first of our hard engineering methods, which is your dams. Now, the dams are used to regulate discharge. If you make something regulated, it has become more regular and controlled. And the idea is that this dam here will hold the water back. So if you get too much water coming down, there's a store here to hold the water out, which then means in certain countries where you'll have a wet season and a dry season, you've then got water that can be released throughout the year if you need water in the dry season. And it becomes this way of you having more control. So if we're defining hard engineering as trying to control, this is a classic example of it. We're going to build this in as big engineering, big construction. We're going to radically change the environment, and we are going to be in control. So the water, as I say, is stored in the reservoir, and it is let out more gradually. So in terms of flood control then, if you've got too much water coming down, rather than it all coming out at once, there is this storage capacity here in the reservoir. You can let that build up and just let the water out gradually, reducing the amount of water that comes downstream. So you can see this in your diagram. Here comes the heavy rain falling in the upper part of the drainage basin. If you have a dam here with the reservoir behind, you can store some of the rainwater there. You can let it out more gradually, so the amount of water coming down the stream is reduced at any one time, and there's less of a flood risk downstream. So you can pause the video here and copy that into your notes. Let's take a look at this video of it in operation.
Southeast Queenslanders depend on the region's dams for safe and reliable drinking water. Dams also supply water for irrigation and areas for recreation. 3 of SEQ Water's dams, Wivenhoe, Somerset and North Pine, have gates which allow us to control the flow of water through the dam. The gates are large steel barriers that we can open to release water and control the flow. Dams can't store all the water that flows into them. Flood mitigation happens when the flood water released through the dam gates is less than the rate of water flowing into the dam from the catchment and from rainfall. The dam temporarily stores some flood water, which results in the level of the dam rising above the drinking water supply level for a short time. This results in the peak in the release of flood water being less than the peak of the water flowing into the dam. This helps to reduce river levels downstream of the dam and mitigate the impacts of flooding on downstream communities. After the flood has peaked, the dam's flood storage compartment must be drained back to the normal drinking water supply level so the dam is ready for the next flood. There are many factors to consider in flood mitigation, such as how much water the dam can hold, the amount of time it takes to release floodwaters, and when floodwaters should be released. Downstream of our largest dam, Wivenhoe, there are other creeks and rivers that flow into the Brisbane River. Flooding in these tributaries is not controlled by dams, and this makes the flood operations for Wivenhoe Dam more complex in the timing and rate of floodwater releases. These factors were considered in developing the Flood Mitigation Manual for operating our gated dams. To learn more about our dam operations and to sign up to our free Dam Release Notification service, please visit our website seqwater.com.au.
So the benefits you can see there, if you think economically speaking, controlling the rate at which the water comes out means then that there's less likelihood that the properties and the infrastructure downstream will be flooded and damaged. And also some of these dams can have some social benefits as well. There can be water sports taking place on them and so forth. But these are not without their negative impacts, because this is a hard engineering approach. This is putting a massive, big, highly engineered structure in the middle of a landscape and completely destroying it. The reservoir was not a natural lake. It is completely produced by human activity itself. So you have this habitat destruction that is the result of the dam and the reservoir forming behind it. And if there are people that are living in this area, they can be displaced. They're forced to move as a result of this. Now, especially in some countries, perhaps in some LEDCs where some of the locals don't have the same kind of power and influence, this can lead to them being displaced against their own wishes, taken away from their ancestral homes, and it can have some really significant social impacts as well as the environmental impacts. So there is your balance between those two. And as we go through this, we're going to construct this knowledge schema that'll help us to understand the pros and the cons of the hard and soft engineering. So does the hard engineering method of dams help in flood control? Well, yes, it can. It can make the discharge more regular. But the big negative here is the loss in the habitat in the reservoir, and it can displace some of the locals. So discharge more regular, habitat loss and displacement of locals. Right, that brings us on to method number 2. If you want to turn over in your books, we're going to be taking a look at levees and embankments. Now, in this case, this is a human-made levee. It's not one of the natural levees that you can get on a floodplain. This is something that's been constructed by humans to raise up the level of the bank. So it's an artificially raised bank, and it's designed to increase the capacity of the river. The capacity, there's your definition, how much water the river can hold. Now, if you have a look at this photograph, why do you think that there was a need to build a levee here? What's the infrastructure that's being protected from flooding? And, well, yes, of course, it's this railway line. Now, talking about increasing the capacity, you can see it because of the plastic that's been placed over the top there. There's the level of the water here where the river is comes to the plastic. Here's the plastic here, and you can see you're coming down a bank. So this water level is higher than the railway is, which means that if the levee wasn't there, the railway lines would be flooded, the trains couldn't go along them, and there's potential longer term damage to the tracks as well. So there's some of the justification for putting in this hard engineering, but again, this is trying to control. It's saying to the river, yes, you can flood, but only as far as here, this far and no further, please. So it's that hard engineering strategy that takes place. Now, again, have a close look at this photograph. I think this is a really interesting one. What do you notice here about the levee? Can you see it? Well, here it is over here. It's massive. Look at how big this is. You get a sense of the scale of these little boats and the cars down here. I'm hoping you can see the side here where the roads are going up the side of the levee, just to give you a sense of how big that bank is. Look at how wide this river is here, and again, the river is sitting way, way, way above the level of the settlements down below. Now, if you live in this house and you come out this morning and you see the water up there, and you can walk up the slope, out of breath to get to the top of this bank, you get there and think, oh my goodness, look at that water. How are you feeling about the levee at that moment? Are you glad it's there? Are you nervous what might happen if it were to break? Because I tell you what, as you walk back down the slope, that's a heck of a lot of water being stored up there. You better be very confident as you go back to your front door and look back up that that levee is going to hold. Will it hold? Well, what are you looking at here? Can you see? Have a think with this photograph. Is the river normally flowing to the left of the picture or to the right? One part here is being flooded. Which part? Look for some clues. There is a pretty big clue, isn't it? This is where the water normally should be. There's your levee to try and protect it. But the force of all of that water, the incredible pressure of all of that water, amazing pressure of it, has caused that levee to burst. And the problem with that now is that there is far more water here just waiting its turn to spill out and to spread all over the floodplain. Floodplain, remember? Floodplain. I'm painting the water in somewhat of a sinister light there. The water's just doing what water does. This is the floodplain, right? This is where the water should be. The question is, should those houses be there? The question is that levee the best way of protecting them? Well, clearly not in this case. It's absolutely spectacularly failed. Okay, this brings us then to the diagrams in your notes. Let's have a look at the annotation that you want to put into this. So, how are the levees methods of protecting infrastructure from flooding? Well, as we've seen in those photographs, absolutely increases the capacity of the river. The river can hold more water before it would reach the top of the levees, and therefore the capacity is increased. That brings the water level above the surrounding area. Now, as long as the water stays there, arguably, you could say, yes, that's fine. We're a bit nervous, but it's fine. Just stay where you are, water, and everything will be okay. But it doesn't always stay where you want it to stay. If the levee fails, there will be even more water to flood the surrounding area. So you don't really get the economic benefits then, do you? And the levees can be damaged. Even if they don't fail entirely, they can be damaged, and there's going to be ongoing costs to protect or to fix them and things like that. Now remember, we're talking about sustainable development here, things that can have a long-term positive impact. And if you're saying by building this to people that come after you, to future generations, you're going to have to go and spend money fixing this, and then fixing it again, and then fixing it again. There's questions about how sustainable that is. Also, if the levee does work and it doesn't burst, then your floodplain, it doesn't get flooded. Now, floodplains are designed to get flooded from an environmental point of view. The plants and animals that are adapted to live there then lose their habitat. So, how good are levees? Do you get flood protection? Well, yes, ish. It can burst. The environmental impacts of levees can be quite severe in terms of the impact on the habitat diversity. Okay, let's take a look at this video.
This is Eureka, Missouri, a city that floods repeatedly. We're talking catastrophic floods twice in less than 2 years.
Yet more rain and dangerous flooding are affecting millions in parts of the Midwest and South tonight.
Taking across the Merrimack River, notorious for flooding very quickly.
Towns like Eureka and others, well, they're in for a rough few days.
But just 12 miles downstream is a town called Valley Park. It stayed pretty dry thanks to a levee, a giant artificial embankment that surrounds the city, designed to keep water out. Valley Park got their levee largely because the city was willing and able to pay for it. It kept their own town dry, but here's what flooding looked like in neighboring towns, including Eureka, that didn't have levees.
The Valley Park levee withstood the water.
That levee holding could be part of the problem.
He suspected the same levee that protected Valley Park may have been to blame for devastating flooding in Fenton, Eureka, and Arnold.
Can a levee protect one town while making flooding worse for others, especially towns that can't afford a levee? A fluid mechanics lab, a 13-foot-long model of a river, and some adorable tiny houses will help us find out. People love levees. There's about 100,000 miles of these embankments across the U.S., sometimes concrete, sometimes earthen, For centuries, we've built them between humans and rivers.
Levee workers transport material by hand, by truck, by boat.
We even write songs about them.
Drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry.
If it keeps on raining, levee's going to break.
When the levee breaks, have no place to stay.
But it turns out, even when levees are effective, they can still be devastating. As far back as 1852, levees came with a very important warning. Charles Ellet Jr., a famed U.S. civil engineer, cautioned that levees confine rivers and cause them to rise higher and flow faster. And relying on levees encourages a false security. But he was largely ignored. Levees became the default for flood control, mostly funded and constructed by local entities. Some riverside communities that could afford it built taller levees for more protection, while less fortunate neighbors dealt with the devastating effects. To show you what we mean, we went to the banks of the Mississippi River, to a fluid mechanics lab where a team of engineers from the University of Minnesota built us this landscape model to test flood scenarios. Overhead, a scanner collects 3D data to measure exactly what's happening. It's a generic model of a river with no levees. That means when the water level increases, it overflows and spreads across the floodplain, often creating important wetland habitat that's home to a variety of species. Putting in levees cuts rivers off from this land, destroying floodplains and wetlands. It allows people to convert these areas into farmland or build houses on them. And while levees protect these communities from flooding, they constrict the river into a narrow channel, making the water flow faster and higher. That creates a bottleneck leading to additional flooding upstream. If all levees are the same height, both sides should be about equally protected from the average flood. And if the river rises so much that the water overtops the levee, then both sides should flood pretty equally. But let's say people on one side of the river lobby for higher levees. Now, instead of both sides flooding, only one floods. The side with the lower levees is at a clear disadvantage. So what can people in flood zones do? We can't just pick up and move major cities. We need levees to protect places like these. There is an alternative. We could build levees farther back so rivers could still expand and create wetlands. These setback levees ease flooding on both sides rather than protecting one city at the expense of another. This approach is common in other parts of the world, like Holland, for example, but not in the US. Here, we tend to build levees right next to rivers. Some communities that can afford to build higher levees do so at the risk of others with little oversight. We do have the Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency tasked with regulating a fraction of all levees. They have to ensure, at least on paper, that federal levees won't dramatically raise local flood levels. But those engineering predictions don't always match reality. For instance, the Army Corps designed Valley Park's levee in the early 90s with data and software from that era. Engineers estimated the levee's impact on neighboring areas would be minimal. But by the time it was completed in 2005, the region had grown significantly. More people had built alongside the river, increasing the risk of flooding, which wasn't considered in the original plan. While we don't know the precise impact of Valley Park's levee on neighboring towns just yet, since the levee was built, the region outside Valley Park has suffered 2 of the worst floods in its history. The Army Corps says they've done nothing wrong and that the levee meets all state and federal laws. But there's a growing body of research that shows levees push flooding onto surrounding communities that have lower levees or no levees at all. Researchers measured water levels around 13 levees in the Midwest and found they all increased flooding, some by over 5 feet. As the climate changes and cities push for higher levees, flooding is only expected to get worse, especially along the Mississippi River, which is almost entirely lined with levees. Some of these embankments have been substantially raised since their completion against federal rules, making flooding worse across the river and upstream. So, yeah, we need some levees, but the system for regulating them is broken. Even though the science overwhelmingly shows that constructing higher levees makes flooding worse in the long term, we keep building them taller, passing our problems upstream.
If it keeps on raining.
So you can very much see that the levees can create as many problems as they solve, even as they're trying to protect some areas from flooding. They can cause other areas to flood more. We'll see that in a moment when we look at one of the other strategies as well. Okay, let's continue to assemble our knowledge schema. Do you remember what we said about dams? Do you remember the positive? Makes the discharge more regular, but the negative was? Do you remember? Habitat loss in the reservoir, and it displaces the local. The levees, what did we say about them? The positive was, yeah, increased river capacity. Yeah, it can hold more water. The negatives, but if the levees fail, then the flooding is worse. It's questionable the extent to which they're actually flood control methods. Right, next up, it's flood walls. Now, flood walls we saw back at the start, and these are the concrete walls that are built along the edge of the riverbanks here, and these are designed to do two main things. So they're going to increase the capacity of the river again. There's more water it can hold here. So in that sense, they're similar to levees, but these tend to be used in urban areas where you've got high value land beside it, and it is designed to stop lateral erosion to protect the buildings and the infrastructure. So here's an example of one of them in work. This is a £4 million scheme needed to fix a broken river wall announced after an MP stepped in. Now, the river wall collapsed here at Arundel, which caused misery to the residents. It's due to be fixed. Now, it's costing £4 million in order to do this. It collapsed January the 8th in 2016, and there was a 2-year campaign by the residents to get it fixed. Now you can see, as I showed you in the previous video, some of the work that has gone on here to try to sort this out in the short term because of the damage to this building here, but a 2-year campaign to get it fixed. The £4 million scheme will be funded by a government grant, including contributions of $750,000 from the councils. The River Road residents, the people living here, confirmed they're going to contribute nearly £300,000 of this through insurance paid and personal contributions. So they're pulling this money in from a variety of sources. The Environment Agency said it's going to be inspecting the river wall on a regular basis to identify changes or deterioration. Now again, that brings us back to this notion of sustainability. Do you remember I talked about the piano keyboard? If you press down on the sustain pedal, you press the key in the piano, take your hand off, and the note will continue to ring out. The whole notion of sustainable management says we're going to keep the longer term in mind as well. We're not going to tie future generations into expensive repairs and ongoing maintenance. And yet, that's exactly what you're looking at here. Does the flood wall protect those buildings? Well, yes, but the flood wall protects those buildings in part by stopping lateral erosion. Well, trying to. This is trying to control. You shall not erode laterally, we're saying to the river. And the river goes, oh, really? I think that I'll have the last word about that. Thank you very much. Lateral erosion is what I do. And the river just comes to the edge of the wall over and over and over again, and the sheer force of it, that erosive power that can erode out massive big valleys and floodplains, looks at the wall and think, I've been doing this for hundreds of years. You think any wall's going to stop me? Now again, I perhaps make the river sound a little bit more sinister than it really is. The river's just doing what it naturally does. Rivers erode. And if we're going to build next to them and put these big hard engineering strategies in place and expect the river to obey us, well, it's only going to end one way. Rivers erode. So, let's have a little bit of a closer look at this particular area. There it is. Let's zoom into this, and you can see the very foundations of those buildings themselves have been undermined, and they've had to place all of these sandbags here so that if the water does come up in future, the house isn't going to be eroded. Now look at that damage. Now remember, this is meant to be flood control to have the economic benefits of stopping the damage. There's not only that incredible expense in repairing the wall, but look at the damage to the house as well. Okay, so time for your diagram. This is a diagram that you'll be doing at the bottom of your book. The idea behind this, as you can see here, is that the flood walls are built at the edge of the river, and the flood walls then are designed to increase capacity. So there you go, greater capacity in the river, it can hold more, and it's also designed to stop lateral erosion and protect the infrastructure. But there's the second point that we've just been looking at there, the need for longer maintenance. Think of everything that I've just said going into that. And the natural channel is absolutely devastated by this. This is turning the natural channel into something that is completely controlled by human nature. Okay, here we go. Here's our evolving schema. Dams, do you remember what the positive was? Do you remember? It is... makes the discharge more regular. What's the negative with the dams though? But loss of habitat in the reservoir, and it displaces local. Next up, what was our next method? It was levees. What's the positive of levees? Do you remember? Increase river capacity, and the negative, but if the levees fail, then the flooding is worse. The method that we've just looked at then is flood walls, and the positive, it can increase capacity, and when they work, they protect the infrastructure, stops lateral erosion, well, slows it down. But there's the cost of maintenance. Now, that little 3-word phrase, all of the stuff you've seen in his videos, or in those pictures I've just shown you, and the loss of the habitat. Which brings us to our final hard engineering method, which is deepening and straightening the channel. Okay, turn to that in your books now. So how do we conduct this? This is done by dredging. You'll remember we met dredging in our River Parrett and River Tone flooding case study. But here is the definition that you'll need in your books. This is to remove sediment from a river bank and bed using a mechanical digger. And here you can see it. The previous one for our case study, you saw the digger sitting on the bank. This one is sitting on a barge in the river, making the river deeper and wider. Now you can definitely see here that the river's getting made wider. You can't see it, but the river's also being made deeper as well. Why would you want to do something like that? Well, let's take a wee look first of all at the video to see this in action. So this is after the flooding in the Tone and the Parrett, whenever the people were calling for dredging, which the Environment Agency had decided not to do, but because of the flooding and because of the public outcry, and the politicians came down to visit, and something had to be seen to be done, so what they do? They dredge. Now you can see this in operation. You can see towards this part how the river has been widened. And you can very much see the difference between this and down here. This is the little bridge that we looked at before. Do you remember that? Showing the bridge and the impact of not dredging there. So you can see dredging the rivers here, significantly making them wider, making the capacity of the river much, much greater and much, much bigger. Now, this is probably a great image and great video to watch whenever we're talking about hard engineering trying to control. This is telling the river how it should behave. Sorry river, you have far too much sediment and silt in you at the moment, and that's really rather inconvenient because of the reduction in the capacity of the river channel here. So I tell you what we're going to do. We are going to come in and remove the sediment. That's going to show you, river, we have big machines, big diggers. We can take all of this sediment out. Look at that sediment that I'm piling up at the side here, and my big digger, river, that's telling you, isn't it? But the river quietly sitting there going, you think? I'm going to play the long-term game here, boys and girls. You may remove that sediment, but you know what's happening near the source? As you're doing that, I'm eroding more sediment and I'm transporting it all the way down here. And do you know what's going to happen when I get down here with all that sediment? I'm going to be starting to deposit it all over again. And you may be here for a few weeks, a few months, but I'm here every hour of every day, year after year, depositing sediment here. This river will silt up again. I will fill the base and the banks of it. And you will have to come back and do this all over again. I guarantee it. So again, you're seeing, I hope, in this how it's really questionable. Is this a sustainable strategy? Well, no, it's not really. It's not a sustainable strategy because you have to keep coming back and doing this because the river will silt up again. So why would you want to do that? What are some of the benefits of doing it? Is it a method of flood control that can work? Well, it does increase the capacity of the river, yes, makes it deeper and wider, so there's more water can fit in. Also, a deeper and wider water or river will have a higher velocity. So that means that the water flowing through here will get out of the way more quickly. So the idea is that you create more space in the river here and you get the water out of the way more quickly. So if more water comes from upstream, this water's moved out of the way faster. Come on, go, get out of the way. It's coming. Come on, let's get out of the way. Now, does that work? Well, let's step back from looking at this in just this small, isolated, here's where I've dredged the river to make it deeper and straighter. And take a look at this. The broader context. What happens next? So remember what we just said? We're moving the water out of here faster. Come on, get out of the way, There's more water coming here. Come on, go, fast. What if you're living here? The bit of the river that isn't straightened, the bit of the river that isn't dredged. What happens to you when all of this water is coming down here? What happens next? I'm sure you guessed it. This area experiences worse flooding than before because you're sending all of that water down there. Now, maybe you're making a judgment call that this is a high density urban area that needs to be protected. This is a low density rural area that doesn't. Maybe you're making that judgment call. And maybe when you sit in your office making that judgment call, that's one thing for you to say. But if this is your home and you're now flooded because of what happened up here, you're not going to be too happy about that, are you? So what are we saying then about this in totality? Well, is it sustainable? Well, the river will silt up again, so you're going to need to repeat it. It can reduce flooding in the area in which it's used, but it actually will make flooding worse elsewhere. And you're going to destroy the natural habitats of the river. You saw that, the impact that those diggers were having on the river channel on the way downstream. It certainly had a massive negative impact. Right, that brings us then to our evolving knowledge schema. Are you ready for this one? Dams. What was the positive? Dams make the discharge more regular, but what's the negative? Do you remember? Can you say it? Habitat loss in reservoir and can displace the locals. What was our next method after dams we looked at? Levees. Good. And what was the positive of levees? What can levees do? Increase river capacity. What's the downside of levees? Do you remember? If the levee fails because it's holding more water, it can make the flooding worse. Right, dams, levees, what came next? Dams, levees, and flood walls. Positives, what do flood walls do? They increase the river capacity again, and they also reduce or slow down lateral erosion to protect the infrastructure. What's the negative? But the cost of maintenance, the ongoing cost of maintenance, and the fact that they devastate the natural habitat of the river. And the last one, dams, levees, flood walls, and deepening, straightening the river. What's the benefit of that? Well, it increases the capacity can hold more, increases the speed, moves it out of the way faster. What's the negative? What's the but? Moves the problem downstream. Yeah, that's right. Gets the water out of the way of your area faster and sends it on to somebody else. And the rivers will do what the rivers do, which is silt up again. Now, hopefully, as you're looking at this, what you can really begin to sense is that when we talk about hard engineering, trying to control, each one of these comes in and says, river, you're not going to operate naturally. We are human beings. We are smart. We're intelligent. We have got big machines. We're going to tell you how you're going to operate. We're going to build a dam. We're going to build levees. We're going to flood walls. We're going to get the diggers in and deepen and straighten it, straighten and deepen, widen it. We are going to control what you're doing. But in the end, the river always wins. And hence, we've got to the stage then in the 21st century where the preference is not for the hard engineering strategies that we're trying to control, but these soft engineering ways of working with the river, ways of saying to the river, can we come to some arrangement here, river? Can we learn to live with each other? And that's what we're going to move on to in the next video, to take a look at all the methods that are used that are soft engineering methods that work with the natural processes, that try to get some flood reduction benefits from it, but also try to do so in such a way as to protect the environment and look after the people as well. In other words, to make them more sustainable. And they're coming up in the next video.